is that this is basically a biblical theology, this course. This is why it's a theology course. It's a biblical theology, so it's derived from Scripture. And it's tracing God's promises about a land for Israel all through the Bible. That's kind of the focus here. As I said yesterday, my view, and I hope you'll agree with me when we get to the end, is that this kind of approach, especially the focus on the covenants, those land promises through the covenants, bind the whole Bible together, right? It gives you a framework to fit the whole Bible in. It'll be becoming clearer and clearer as we go. And allows you to see kind of in a panorama what God is doing in the world and how that is centered in this concept of a land for Israel. So that's what we're doing here this morning. Were there any questions left over from yesterday? Okay, so just to review a little bit, my attempt was to lay a foundation in Genesis, especially Genesis 1 through 11, for what God was going to do starting in Genesis 12 by giving a land to Israel. So we talked about how in Genesis 3:15, God promised to bring a seed through the woman. God did that, and then preserved that line, preserved that seed through Genesis 6. Through the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, he repopulated the earth and created nations, right? Remember the word that's translated nations in the Bible? Goy. Yeah. And a goy is a word that means nation in all its dimensions. So some of the things we talked about that characterize a nation are a common language, a common what we call generally culture, but also things like borders. Right, that nations have borders. They have a land that's associated with them. We saw that in Genesis 10. And when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were dispersed, when their nation was dispersed, they were dispersed to different lands. Right? They also have governments, so there's a distinctive way that they rule. They're sovereign. They act independently. So we saw that in Genesis 10, and we noticed in cross-referencing that with what Paul says in Acts 17, that it's God who establishes these nations. It's God who determines the borders. It's God who decides how long they're going to exist, how long they're going to be in place. And the reason that God could do that is because he has created the earth. He owns everything. He owns the land. It's his. So he can do with it whatever he wishes. He is sovereign. We discussed sovereignty. And when we got into the Abrahamic covenant, we saw that God had these plans that he established in eternity past. So before the first opening phrase of the Bible, in the beginning God created, he already had in place a plan, an eternal plan, from the beginning to the end. So when God says, when the Bible says in the beginning, the implication is that there's an end coming. There's going to be an end at some point. So God has this plan, and he's working that plan out in history, and history has a beginning and an ending. So history's going somewhere. It's not just a series of random events, disconnected or something. It's a purposeful progress that God is making to achieve a particular goal. And we notice that not only is history going somewhere, but that God has revealed to himself, to us, some of what he's going to do in history. And that's where the covenants come in. The covenants are God's commitment to act in a certain manner no matter what. And that's what we looked at yesterday in the Abrahamic covenant, which was the first one we looked at, where God had told Abraham. And a covenant, again, is sometimes it's characterized as an agreement. I prefer to think of it as a commitment. Sometimes a commitment is two ways. The ones we're looking at are one-way commitments. Right? So these are commitments that God makes. And the commitment he made to Abraham is to make him a great nation, to cause him to have a great name, to be blessed, to be a blessing, and that he would be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And that if they reciprocated, that is, if they would bless Israel, then God would bless the other families of the earth. And if they were even slighted Israel, God would utterly destroy them. So that's what we looked at yesterday and how we kind of tie this together. So we're going to move on today to look at this next covenant, which is in older works that you'll find. It's called the Palestinian covenant. So if you noticed on the shelf out there, Dr. Pentecost's kind of seminal book, Things to Come. If you look up Things to Come, if you try to find land covenant, you probably won't find it. He calls it the Palestinian covenant. I don't really like that name. In my book, there's a long footnote explaining that. But so I use the term land covenant. I'd like you guys to do that as well. Palestine is a kind of a made-up place. Doesn't really, never really existed. It was actually rooted in anti-Semitism in about 135 BC when Jerusalem was utterly destroyed. This is post-70. Was utterly destroyed for a second time. Jews were driven out of the land, and the land was renamed to Palestine, just to try to eradicate any trace of Israel there, which of course is impossible. But so we call this the Palestinian covenant. If you turn to Deuteronomy 32:8, start there for a second. Give you a chance to turn there. So this is in a section that's kind of referred to as the Song of Moses, and is what frequently happens in Deuteronomy is Moses is rehearsing first, reflecting on, we do this ourselves, what God has already done for his people as a basis for what he will do for them. So we often do this in prayer. We thank God for what he's done in our lives, and gives us confidence for what we're about to ask him to do for us. So we see that here, but with regard to the land, so we're looking again through the perspective of God's promises for land. If you look in verse 8, it said, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, so he's talking about Genesis 10, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. What do you think he's saying there? Set the boundaries of the people according to the number of sons of Israel.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, according to their sons. What's he talking about setting those boundaries?
Nation.
Nations, yeah. And then so he's setting the boundaries for the nations and according to the sons of Israel. What do you think?
The tribal divisions.
Yeah, but according to.
How they relate, how the nations relate to Israel.
Or how much room they need. So it's almost as if God's going to put together this puzzle of nations, and the first piece he's going to put down is Israel. And then he's going to arrange the rest of the pieces around them. Right? So even from the beginning, as we discussed yesterday, even from the beginning, God had this plan. The fact that he is landing Israel in an area that's already occupied by 7 other nations is not an accident. That God has arranged this in a certain way, and that's what Deuteronomy 38 is saying. That he's kind of set this up. And he's determining how the nations of the earth are going to be distributed on the face of the earth by first putting Israel in place.
You see that separation between Lot and Abraham, correct?
Yeah, so you see that going on as well. That wasn't random, right? God's sovereign. He knew that was going to happen. He probably caused that. I'm not going to say probably. He did. He caused that to happen. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Lot left The fact that the 7 nations are in that land when Israel has to go in the book of Joshua, that's not an accident. God arranged that. He set that up. It's got a purpose. He's got a plan. History is not a series of random events. He's at work there. Questions on it? Yes, sir. Roland?
You said how much land?
So, yeah, I think what Deuteronomy 32:8 is saying is that God put Israel in place first and then arranged the rest of the nations around Israel. So, give you an example. My background is Croatian. Anybody know where Croatia is? All right. So, if you look where Italy is and look to your right, across the Adriatic Sea, Croatia's over there. Probably haven't heard of Croatia because it had been at one point.
Used to be
Go ahead.
Yugoslavia.
Yugoslavia. It was part of Yugoslavia. Yeah. Part of these Balkan nations. So Yugoslavia no longer exists, right? That nation has come and gone. Has Israel gone anywhere? No. Yeah. So God planted Israel in their place and arranged these other nations, and these other nations are going to come and go. But Israel's going to be there. Because that was God's eternal plan, His sovereign plan. It's not an accident. Right? It's not just a series of historical events that just happen. Right? God is orchestrating history. Dave?
That's exactly correct. That's the most emphatic prophecy in Deuteronomy 32:8, because everything centers around Israel to the end time complete. 100%, everything, all world history centers around Israel being in that land by 32:8.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's key.
It's the key to the whole
Yeah.
thing.
Yep. So, and Dr. Erlander said it, so it must be true.
I just agree with Jesus and he agrees.
Okay, good. All right. So it is key. I mean, that's why we're starting there this morning before I get into the land covenant itself, because this is what God has determined is going to happen. And again, one of my goals is that when you guys walk away at the end of the day today, you'll be able to see what's happening in the world from God's sovereign perspective and what He's doing, and that it's centered in Israel. What did somebody say? Israel is God's timepiece? Yeah. So it's the center of history, really. It's really the center of history. You know, we worry about what's going on in Washington this week or next week. And yeah, that's got some of interest because God is at work, right? He's raising up nations and bringing them down. He is stirring things up in the world, and His whole purpose is around Israel. And ultimately, His purpose is to what?
Glorify Himself.
Bring glory to Himself. That through this whole process, God's going to glorify Himself. The only question that is left for us then is which side of history we're going to be on. I'm not talking about salvation. I'm talking about how we live, our sanctification. Which side of history we're going to be on. Are we going to believe God or not? All right, so let's go on. So again, yesterday we went over some introductory matters, what my goals were here. We talked about Noah and the nations, creation of the nations, and went through the Abrahamic covenant. And then this morning we'll hit the land, Davidic, and new covenants. So last time what we discussed is God continues to work on the earth to bring forth this promised seed of a woman. And as I've emphasized a few times, when you're reading Genesis, note that the whole creation account there from the very beginning is centered on this earth, right? That God is creating everything, but the center of the story is the earth. It's the land, right? That's where the center of the story is. So we discussed that and how God promised in Genesis 3:15 the seed of a woman who was going to come and restore what was lost in the fall. He's going to crush Satan. And then this seed follows a particular line. You remember Abraham was how many generations from Adam? 20 generations from Adam. So he's in this line of seed from Shem, Ham, and down to Abraham. Remember Shem, Eber, Terah, Abraham. So he is in this line of the seed that was promised to the woman. And we trace that through Genesis 6, where it seems to me, again, there's multiple interpretations about what's going on in Genesis 6, but it seems to me that the purity of the seed is under assault by satanic forces. So God, in the first act of grace recorded in the Bible, reaches in, grabs Noah, shows him favor, and preserves the remnant. This is God's first recorded act of grace in the Bible, specifically identified as an act of grace, when he reaches in and preserves this remnant through Noah. And then we come to the Abrahamic covenant, where God has sovereignly, unilaterally, unconditionally, and eternally bound himself by a formal, solemn covenant and an oath to carry out these promises of land, seed, and blessing to Abraham. He has committed himself to do that. And again, this is a covenant that's unconditional. That God doesn't, we've made a contrast at the beginning of the day between conditional and unconditional promises. This is an unconditional promise that God is going to do this no matter what. And he's going to do this for Abraham and his seed. Right? So again, God's holy name is at stake. I mean, God has done this to himself. Have you ever said anything that wish you could retract those words? Yeah, absolutely. God doesn't do that, though. Right? God says something and it stands. And when God bound himself by both a covenant and an oath, he has committed himself to a course of action. That God's got to come through, or he is not a God worth worshiping. He's got to do this. He's bound himself. He made that choice himself to bind himself to a particular course of action, to work things out in his plan through history in a particular way. That's what we see in the Abrahamic covenant. Particular course of action. We noticed in Genesis we looked at 22:16, where he promises he swears on oath, not only by covenant, but also on oath to uphold those promises. And he commits his person and character, all his attributes. Everything's on the line as far as God's concerned with regard to these promises that he's made to Abraham. That this has got to come out. And so that, therefore, if the covenant is not kept, then God's name is defamed. Right? His name is can't be trusted anymore. God's made this incredible commitment, I guess is the way we can put it, of himself. He has invested himself in the future, and again, we're looking specifically in this course in the land. He's invested himself in providing that land. Just for your own future study, you could go through, similar to what we're doing here, and look at the seed or the blessing as well, and trace those through the Bible. See how those continue. So God's got to keep his covenant. He's got to keep his promise, or he's not worth trusting. Right? You can't trust him. Bottom line, and God set it up like that. He's proving himself. He's proving himself to be faithful in how he establishes Israel. So again, if let's turn to Isaiah 41. It's interesting here how God has identified who he is, staked himself. So what God's doing in Isaiah 41 here is he is using some sarcasm, I think, to ridicule these pagan gods, so-called gods. And he is identifying, how do you know what a true God is from what a false God is? And he's saying to Israel, present your case, the Lord says. Bring forward your strong arguments. The king of Jacob says, let them bring forth and declare to us what is going to take place. So he's saying, okay, you want to prove that you're a God? Tell me the future. Tell me what's going to happen. In other words, a true God can do that. As for the former events, declare what they were. So not only look forward and explain what's going to happen, but also look back and tell me why. Why did it happen? That we may consider them and know their outcome, or announce to us what is coming. Declare the things that are going to come afterward, that we may know that you are gods. Indeed, do good or evil, that we may anxiously look about us and fear together. Behold, you are of no account, and your work accounts to nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. So God is setting up some criteria here about how do you tell a true God from a false God. A true God can tell what's going to happen in the future. A false God can't. So if God makes a covenant to Abraham and says, I'm going to do this in the future, and he doesn't do it, he doesn't meet his own criteria for being God. He doesn't meet his own standard. So again, God is voluntarily, he's sovereign, but he is voluntarily constraining his course of action to what he has said in his word as a proof of who he is, as a demonstration of his sovereignty. So at some point we'll step back, as Paul does at the end of Romans 11, and say, oh, the knowledge and wisdom of God, who can search it out? Who can know it? Well, we should have the same reaction when we look at things like this. So it's by his own criteria. If he can't predict the future with accuracy, then he is not a God that's to be worshipped. He's saying people who worship gods like that are an abomination. So he is staking a lot on his promises to Israel. His promise to Abraham to create this nation, this land. So we talked about before how the Abrahamic covenant is often characterized by three things: land, seed, and blessing. Right? Land, seed, and blessing. So you often hear it broken down into those three components. And as we discussed yesterday, revelation happens over a period of time, right? It doesn't happen all at once. God didn't say everything from the very beginning. He expands it. And we saw that in the book of Genesis, how he built on that commitment to Abraham in Genesis 15 and 17 and 22. He kind of expands it. So here in this Abrahamic covenant, he is going to come with other covenants that expand the scope of each of these features of the Abrahamic covenant. So we'll see in the land covenant, the focus of course is on land. In the Davidic covenant is on the seed. And in the new covenant in Jeremiah is on this blessing. This blessing that's coming. So here's should be a familiar chart for some of you guys. I think Dr. Cohn has this in his Bible survey book. So here's the at the top there you see a chronology, timeline of the Bible. I think there's make me a liar here, but I think 13 books that form the kind of the historical framework for the Bible, the backbone of history that runs through the Bible. And then the rest of the books, the complementary wisdom and prophetic books, kind of hang off of that timeline, right? So when we look at these covenants, we can put them in this timeline, and we see the Abrahamic covenant, chapter 12 of Genesis. So I think that's best calculation I can make. I think that happens about 2082 BC. I'll have the chart up here in a minute. Now we're going to have the land covenant. It's in Deuteronomy 30, so it's a little bit later, toward the end of Deuteronomy here. So we see that this gap of time has occurred, right? This period of time, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob have all come and gone. Moses is about to depart. So a period of time has gone by. In fact, again, 2082 to about 1400 BC is what we're looking at. So that's 682 years. So it's a long time. Longer than the United States has been around. Right?
Not longer.
So this covenant is being developed over the course of history. Over the course of time, God's elaborating on it. He's providing more and more insight into what he's doing. He's making more and more specific commitments on how he's going to work this out. So God is providing us in the pages of his word insight into what he's doing. And he kind of invites us to adopt this view of how he's working in history. Right? And he's carrying it out. He's working it out. So quite a long time. Surprising sometimes. Are you surprised by how long this is taking? Yeah. So it's interesting how this is happening. So he makes this covenant, and then again, this Abrahamic, between the Abrahamic and land covenant, is this thing called the Mosaic covenant. Who's heard of that? Right. So, right, there's a Mosaic covenant in between, established in Genesis 20, 19 and 20. Exodus. Elaborated on there. The Levitical laws are part of that Mosaic covenant, 613 regulations. Basically, you can look at it as Israel's constitution. So this is a step in their evolution of being a nation. I think when they're called out from Israel, they are a nation at that point. That God brings out, it says in Deuteronomy, how when before has the Almighty brought one nation out of another. So they're a nation when they come out of Exodus. The Mosaic covenant was a temporary covenant. We'll come to look at this in more detail when we get to the new covenant, but just the name of it, the name new, implies that it's replacing something, right? But it's a temporary covenant. The Mosaic covenant was never meant to be eternal. In Galatians, Paul characterizes it as a pedagogos, translated teacher, but in Greek it was more like a guardian for a child. Not just a teacher, but someone who protects them, who takes care of them, who guards them in their life. And that's what the purpose of the Mosaic covenant was Paul says, is to be a guardian until the Messiah came, until Jesus came, to shepherd the nation, to protect them, to separate them from the people around them. That's what it was supposed to be for. So it's just a temporary covenant. And doesn't replace or invalidate the covenant with Abraham. Again, in Romans 11, Paul goes, and we'll talk about this later today, Paul goes to great pains to make sure that everyone understands that the Abrahamic covenant wasn't replaced or invalidated or canceled by the Mosaic covenant. That those covenants with the patriarchs continue. They're not ended, they don't replace. So this Mosaic covenant was a temporary instrument that God used to protect his people, and did not replace the Mosaic covenant or the Abrahamic covenant. But it did establish an important principle that obedience brings blessing. Right? Obedience to the Mosaic covenant was going to bring blessing to Israel. You know, we looked at it yesterday, but let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 4 one more time. So it might raise the question in your mind, what is the relationship between the Abrahamic and the Mosaic covenant? What is the relationship there? And again, I'm going to focus on land, so this will be a good demonstration. Deuteronomy 4:1, the Lord says, Moses is saying, "Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and judgments which I am teaching you to perform." So this is a restatement of that Mosaic covenant. So that, when you're doing your Bible study, make note of phrases like "so that," right? God is giving you his reason, his purpose for doing something, or what he's telling his people to do. The reason that they are supposed to keep those statutes and judgments is that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, is giving you. So see that what's going on here is that the land, they already possess it, but in order to go in and take up residency, in order to live in the land, they're to obey the Mosaic covenant. That's the condition. The fact that they own the land is unconditional. God's committed himself to do that. It's their land. But in order to live there, they have to obey this Mosaic covenant. That's the condition that God put on them. And then if you turn to Deuteronomy 27, I'm sorry, 28. I'll just read the first couple of verses there. God delineates all the benefits that are going to accrue to them by obeying this law. Now it shall be, if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. See that echo of the Abrahamic covenant. All these blessings will come upon you and your and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall you be the offspring of your body, and the produce of the ground, and the offspring of your beasts, the increase of your herd, and the young of your flock. And it goes on and on to verse 14 there. Blessing after blessing. And if you just generalize these or try to summarize them, a blessing of prosperity and blessing of security. As I mentioned yesterday, prosperity teachers today make a significant dispensational mistake because they try to take all these blessings of prosperity and security and say, if you give to my ministry, you're going to enjoy these kinds of blessings. Well, these are blessings for Israel. And blessings for Israel when they obey the Mosaic covenant and they're in the land. Not blessings for us. Then verse 15 is the other side of the coin. But it shall come about, if you do not obey the Lord your God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes with which I charge you today, that these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the country. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the offspring of your body and the produce of your ground, the increase of your herd and the young of your flock. And on it goes until the end of the chapter, from verse 15 all the way to verse 68. Significant warning. So the relationship between the Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant is that in order to enjoy the blessings under the Abrahamic covenant, they had to obey the Mosaic covenant. Had to do that. Which, of course, they failed, but we'll get there when we get there. And let me just say, this principle that obedience brings blessing is true for Israel, but we think about it today, and, in our own personal lives, we can only be in two places, right? Spiritually speaking. In a place where God is blessing us or a place where he's chastising us. Right? There's no in between. That we're either doing what God has asked us to do in his word during this church age. We're either doing that or he's correcting us. He's guiding us. He won't let us alone. Again, we're not talking about salvation here. We're talking about sanctification and being saved people, children of God. He is going to chastise us if we are not doing according to his will. He won't bless us, he'll be chastising us. There's no in between. So this principle, generally speaking, of obedience brings blessing, was true for Israel in a very material way, and it's true for us as well today. Daniel, you have a question?
No,
Okay,
just
all right.
stretching. No,
Okay, that's fine. You can hitch.
I'm fidgety.
That's fine. So again, this covenant with Moses establishes these conditions to occupy the land. And once they occupy the land, God is going to set his name there. When God talks about my name, what is he referring to? Is he just talking about he's going to write Yahweh in the sand?
Reputation.
His reputation?
Establishing his authority over
His authority? Yeah, everything. Name stands for everything about God. His presence, his presence in the land. He'll be known to be there. Everything about him will be associated with the land. He's going to set his name there. God is also going to be present in a very real way. Promises that once they're in the land, he's going to be present among them. You know, there's some kind of crazy things sometimes that you see. For example, in the book of Leviticus, there's one, I should have looked it up, but there's one regulation there where if someone has to go to the bathroom, they need to take a shovel, walk outside the camp and dig a hole. It's like, why is that there? Well, if God's going to be walking in the camp, you don't want him to be offended by what he might find on the ground. Because he's going to be present among them in a literal way. Very literal way. So God's not only going to set his name in the land, but he's going to be present in the land, and he's going to dwell there forever. He's going to be there. This land is going to continue. You know, one of the interesting features in the Bible is that, and I'm going to be teaching, I think, a course on Revelation as well, is that the whole Old Testament is kind of focused on this, focused on God coming to his land, to his people, establishing them there, and the Messiah would be among them. It's kind of the focus of the whole Old Testament. It's not till we get to the New Testament, specifically Revelation 21 and 22, that we find the eternal state. That it doesn't seem to me as if Israel of the Old Testament is looking beyond the arrival of the Messiah and the setting up of his kingdom. It's only, which happens in Revelation 19, 21 and 22 is where the eternal state is revealed. And the eternal state is not floating around on clouds in heaven somewhere. It's landed. It's on the earth. Jerusalem exists, has come to earth. And what's going on is nations are bringing their wealth into this city of Jerusalem that's been set up. So even in eternity, nations exist. They don't go away. As I mentioned yesterday in that series of Borders and Bibles, if you're of the opinion that borders are somehow need to be eradicated, you're on the wrong side of history. That's not where history's going. Even in the eternal state, there's going to be nations which are defined by land and borders and leaders. And in the eternal state, those nations are going to be bringing their wealth to God who dwells forever in this land. Right? It's going to be on earth. So this is the conditions to occupy the land, and when they're in the land, he's going to set his name, he's going to be present, he's going to be there forever with them. So this is what's at stake in the Mosaic covenant. So, brings up some questions here. On the one hand, Abraham's descendants possess the land. It's been provided to them by this unconditional covenant that we saw in Genesis 12 and then elaborated on through the book of Genesis. It's guaranteed with covenant and oath by God. On the other hand, there's a little problem here because the land's occupied. There's people there. They're going to resist them. Put yourself in the sandals of the Israelites standing on the plains of Moab listening to Abraham. What kind of questions are coming up in your mind? Do we really still own that land? There's 7 nations. And how are those nations described in terms of, with regard to Israel? Those nations are what with regard to Israel? More powerful, more numerous. These are stronger nations that they're facing. Israel has been wandering in the desert for 40 years at this point. A whole generation has died. And they're facing a formidable foe. Do we still own that land? Did the disobedience of our parents, their refusal to go up and take that land of milk and honey, did that invalidate the covenant? It's got to be in their mind. Did the covenant at Sinai set apart the covenant with Abraham? We've got this new covenant, this Mosaic covenant. Is this what we're supposed to follow? Does this replace those promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Can we still hope to live and worship in the land that was promised to them? Can we still expect to go in there? I mean, all these things got to be floating around in their mind, or some of them at least, to a certain extent, as they're standing there looking at this formidable enemy that they need to eject from this land. So, we're going to walk through this Deuteronomy 30, so turn in your Bibles there. I want to make sure you guys know where it's at. I'll be walking through it on the screen here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take it a piece at a time. So if you're eating an elephant, how do you do that? One bite at a time. So we're going to take Deuteronomy 30 one bite at a time. I'm going to read through the section for us, just so we can get the overview, and then we'll dive in and look at it a little bit more closely. So that's the pattern that we're going to follow this morning. So Deuteronomy 30, 1 to 2, and I'm reading out of the NASB. So it shall be when all of these things have come upon you, the blessings and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where the Lord your God has banished you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul according to all that I have commanded you today, you and your sons. So let's just stop there and look a little bit more closely at these opening verses, what's going on here. So it shall be when all these things, it's not an if, right? God's not saying, if this happens to you, then I'm going to do this. He's saying pretty clearly, when this happens, when you have experienced these curses and blessings, when this has happened. Why doesn't Israel obey God? You know, you ask that question over and over. What are they doing? Why do they keep backsliding? If you go back just a page, Moses is saying in chapter 29 that, talking about the words of this covenant of, it's the book of Deuteronomy, and he's talking about how good God has been to them. Then in verse 4, yet to this day the Lord has not given you a heart to know, or eyes to see, nor to hear, that I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandal has not worn out on your foot. And it goes on, you've eaten bread, I've taken care of you, but God had not given them a heart to understand that. Isn't that interesting that God prevented him from recognizing his grace according to his sovereign plan to bring glory to himself ultimately. So they did not understand God's grace. Then it says, you will return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart. Again, the idea here is that not that they're going to, gin up the self-discipline to change their heart. They can't do that. The idea here is that God's going to do that. God's going to return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart. God's going to do that for them. God's going to change their heart. God's going to repair their soul. They're not going to do it. This is coming in the future. When all this stuff has happened to you, then I'm going to step in. I'm going to change your heart. Why do they need a heart change? Why do they need a soul change?
Well, they're a stiff-necked people.
Stiff-necked, yeah.
They're stubborn.
And that stubbornness prevents them from doing what? What's the criteria?
Staying obedient.
Staying obedient to the Mosaic law. They just keep drifting away from it. So even the Mosaic law provided provision, or made provision for disobeying it, right? What was the provision of the Mosaic law if you disobeyed it?
Be cursed.
Well, it was all the sacrifices, right? So you can obey the Mosaic law, but that doesn't mean that you've kept every law. It means that if you've broken a law and you make a sacrifice, you're still in compliance with the law. They couldn't even do that. They ran after other gods. They were idolaters. That's why they were ultimately ejected from the land. So again, in these first couple of verses, God's saying when this happens to you, not if, and that God himself is going to bring about this change of heart that's going to enable them to give their whole heart and soul to him, which is what's necessary in order for them to go in and take the land. Again, what he's talking about here, all that I command you today is obedience to the commands of Deuteronomy. That's the standard of obedience to get into the land. There's a tendency sometimes to read the New Testament back into the Old Testament and to spiritualize things that are happening. So, when it says something like that, do all that I command you today, sometimes people will think about, their prayers, and they get this intention that they need to, call someone and encourage them, and they say, okay, that's a command from God, I have to be obedient to that. And I understand that kind of line of thinking, but don't bring that back into the Old Testament, right? Don't bring that back here. Because when he says that he's going to give them a heart to do all that I command you today, what he's talking about is these laws in Deuteronomy specifically. And again, it's literally what he's saying there. If they do these things, they're going to go in and possess the land, and there's going to be a chicken in every pot, right? That they are going to have prosperity. They are going to have security. These are very literal promises. Sometimes dispensationalism is criticized because we are what they would say carnal, right? We are focused on the flesh. We're focused on worldly benefits. But I think the Bible is, not dispensationalists. The Bible is. So this is a literal promise, and we're going to see as we go through the day that this carries over. This doesn't stop. Right? It's not spiritualized or radically reinterpreted when we get to the New Testament. It continues. So, we'll go on here. 3 through 5 then. So we'll just keep taking these apart little by little. So after all this, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are at the ends of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. The Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. And he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. So again, this promise continues. And see any conditions in here yet? No, this is a commitment that God's making. And it's building on this land aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. That he is going to bring them back into the land. The Lord your God will restore you. He's going to bring he's going to do it. He's going to bring his covenant people back into the land that he promised them. And he is committing himself to do that. And again, this is envisioning a multi-phase process here of regathering. Regathering over a period of time. Again, it's not like they're going to disappear from wherever they're at and suddenly reappear like some Star Trek thing in Israel. There's a period of time where he's going to be gathering them back in. He's going to be drawing them back into the land. And the gathering is, note that here, it's from a worldwide dispersion. So they're scattered across the world. I don't think he's talking about the scattering of the northern tribe in 722 here, taking him to Assyria, or the exile of the southern tribes in 605 and 586 to Babylon. I think he's talking about a worldwide dispersion. This is a different thing that he's going to regather them from than these local exiles from the land. And the fathers possessed the land that was passed permanently into their possession because God gave it to them. And again, obedience is not required for ownership, just for occupation. That's what's at stake here. Not for ownership, just for occupation. We can, just to draw a parallel, not to spiritualize, but just to draw a parallel with our experience during the church age, is that to experience the blessings of God, we need to be in that place of blessing. We need to be in that place of obedience. Right? We need to be building on our faith. Turn to 2 Peter 1:5. So Peter is talking about, in fact, I've got should have mentioned this, I've got a blog, theofaith.org, doing a series there on Peter's end time survival guide, kind of on these verses here. Peter's telling his readers how to live in the end times, what they are to do. And he starts out in this passage here encouraging them to reflect on the salvation and the riches of salvation they have. He says, God has given you everything you need for life and godliness, that is being granted to you, and these great promises, magnificent promises, so that by them you may be partakers of divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. So that, this is all a done deal. This is completed in their salvation. Then he goes on, now for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence. The ESV translates that as supplement your faith. So Peter is urging the readers to build on the faith that they have. Right? That salvation is great, but we want to be sanctified as well. And there's these things that they're to add to their faith. Moral excellence, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. If these qualities are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. So there's the place of blessing right there. Right? If you want to be fruitful and effective in the knowledge that you have of the Lord Jesus Christ, Peter says that, the way to do that is to build on your faith. At virtue and self-control and steadfastness and knowledge and godliness and brotherly affection and love. That's how you do that, right? Kind of parallel to what we see here is that if Israel wanted to be a place of blessing, they needed to build on the salvation that God has given them by obeying the Mosaic covenant. Otherwise, they're going to be in this place of chastisement. That's the only alternative there, is if they're not going to obey. So that's what he's saying here in Deuteronomy 30, 3 through 5. He's going to bring them back. He's going to bring them back from this apparently worldwide dispersion, and he's going to restore them. He's going to restore them internally, their souls. And then God will bless them in the land. He's going to prosper them beyond whatever Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob experienced. So notice how he's opening out this promise that he made to Abraham. Now he's opening it out to the nation. So in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, then he goes on, moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart in the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, so that you may live. So that you may live. Again, this is something God is going to do. He's not calling them to, buck up, guys. He's not telling them to discipline yourself. He's saying the Lord your God will circumcise your heart. He's going to do that. Notice how we've gone from, again, in the progress of Revelation, that God is revealing here, He is going to repair whatever's broken. But in Genesis 17:10, we were talking about physical circumcision. A mark signifying participation in the Abrahamic covenant. But now in the process of Revelation over the 600 years, it's become not only that, but also this spiritual circumcision. Circumcision of the heart. Cutting away that hardness, that resistance. God is going to do that. And He's talking about here an inner commitment to this covenant. An inward change that's going to make them want to obey. Isn't that always our problem, is our wanter is out of sync with God, right? Maybe that should be, it's one of my main prayers is, Lord, make me desire the things you desire. Sort me out. That's what God's promising to do here. And it's, again, He's saying He's going to do it. It's going to happen. And Paul, I think Paul reflects this. Romans 11 says, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them. What do you think Paul's talking about when he says, this is my covenant with them? He's talking about this, and we're going to see it gets expanded later on. When I take away their sins. This is Messiah. This is Jesus. See, Paul is looking forward to a time when Jesus comes and dwells in Zion. He's in the land. And He is going to take away their sin. He is going to repair that. He's looking forward to that change. And He's looking back on this commitment that God has made. So verse 7 then. The Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. So it's interesting change that's coming here is that God is going to bring the curses of Deuteronomy 28 on their enemies, right? He's going to turn that equation around here. He's going to, and Jeremiah talks about this 700 years later. He says, those who devour you will be devoured. All your adversaries, every one of them will go into captivity. So they were in captivity? I'm reversing that. There's this big reversal coming. They're going to go into captivity. They're going to be trapped. Those who plunder you, I will plunder, and all who prey on you, I will give for prey. So Jeremiah is looking forward to this time. He's anticipating this time when all those people who had taken Israel captive, who had been a prey on them, who had been abusing them, God's going to turn that all around. There's a word for that, this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth kind of judgment. It's called talionic judgment. Talionic judgment. He turns that around. What you have done to them, I'm going to do to you. And it's God that's doing it. Yes, sir.
Oh, can I just
Alan,
make a,
right?
yeah, can I just make a comment?
Absolutely. If it's agreeing with me, that's great.
Yeah. Well, I would say that there was a book that I read, the title I can't remember exactly, but it's something to the effect that as goes America is how they treated Israel. John McTernan, and it talks about, the administrations in this country and how the leadership turned their back on Israel and kind of documents all the...
And suffered the consequence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talked a little bit about that last night. Genesis 12:3. Those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you. And if you recall last night, I mentioned that first word curse refers to just kind of an insult. Kind of, your feet smell sort of insult. I will curse was the same word that God that used to describe what happened to Adam at the fall. So if you insult my people, I am coming down on you like a ton of bricks. That's what he's promising there. And that's what we see in history.
Yeah.
And that's why I say, I think if you look at history through the lens of these covenants, it's very illuminating. You know, it makes you confident in what God's doing. So thanks for bringing that up. So 6 and 9 here, 6 through 9. And just back up a little bit. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God. Let me just drop down to verse 8. And you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments, which I command you today. Then the Lord your God will prosper you abundantly in all the work of your hand, in the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and all the produce of the ground, for the Lord your God will rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers. So again, this promise of prosperity when they're in the land. The nation is certainly going to obey. God's guaranteeing that this is going to happen. Which means, again, in this context, keeping these commandments in Deuteronomy. It's specifically what he's saying, that they're going to do this. He's going to cause the nation to be prosperous, as we've seen. This is part of the promise. And the blessing that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As I said last night, January 1st comes around, and you start reading through the Bible for 2020. Take a highlighter, take a pencil, same color. Every time you see references like this to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, underline that. You'll be amazed how often the Abrahamic covenant echoes through the Bible, holding the whole Bible together, in my opinion. So verse 10, if you obey the Lord to keep his commandments and statutes written in this book, if you turn to the Lord your God. So, what's going on here? Is he now introducing a condition right at the end? God said, I'm going to do all this stuff. And now right at the end, he puts a condition on it. Let's take a look at that. On the one hand, if you compare the translations, he said on the one hand, it says in the NASB, the King James, in the NIV, it's got this if-then thing. If you obey, if you turn. But the ESV and the New Revised Standard Version don't translate it like that. Right? So it's a little hermeneutics class now. It says when you obey, when you turn. When you turn, because you turn. So it doesn't have the conditional element in these translations. So why is that? Well, as you can imagine, Hebrew syntax allows for either a conditional statement or a temporal clause. If or when allows for either. Hebrew syntax. So if you have a situation like that, and syntax allows for either translation, how do you resolve that? Context is everything. Thank you, Leon. There you go. So you're going to look at the context. So what's happening in the context? Context always determines the choice that you make. So the immediate context has 9 specific, sovereign, unilateral actions that God is going to make. We've gone through these verses now, and you can see them. Promise after promise after promise that God is going to do this. So when we get to the end, the expectation is that God's going to do these things. Right? Why change at that point? Why take a different alternative view? So I think the better translation is when you obey. Not if you obey. When you obey. That's the best way to translate that. So when they obey, all these things are going to come upon them. Does that make sense? Context is key. Talk to Lena. So let's just summarize this. What has he promised them? He's promised to restore them from captivity to freedom. He has promised to gather them from among the people that they're living with at the time. Again, a worldwide gathering in my reading of this. It says to gather them from the furthest reaches of the earth, not just Babylon, not just Assyria, from everywhere. And then bring them back He's promised to return them to the land of the patriarchs, the same land he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, same land that we saw in Genesis 12:7. Abraham went out and started building altars, right? He's going to give them and their dependents a heart that's devoted to them. He's going to do that. He's going to change their hearts so they're devoted. He's going to inflict judgment on their enemies and extravagantly bless them. He's going to rejoice over them. This is the future for Israel. God's committing himself. It's his commitment. It's what he said he's going to do. So let's look at this again. Just back up. Kind of fit this into what we've said and where we're going. What's happened here is God expands his land promise. Made this promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Now he's making a commitment to the nation to do these things for the nation. He's kind of building on this land promise in the Abrahamic covenant. The possession of the land of Canaan is a settled issue. From Genesis 12, 1 through 7, onward in the Bible, who owns that land is not the question. The question is, will they occupy it? And this is answering that question. They will. They will. God set up a condition that they have to obey the Mosaic law in order to occupy it, and they will. God's guaranteed it. So there's going to be a physical and then a spiritual restoration of the nation to the promised land. It's a different class. We could talk about that in detail sometime. Maybe we'll bring it up again later. But there's going to be a kind of a two-phase restoration. First, God's going to restore them to the land. We saw that in here as one promise. And then he's going to change their hearts. That's a separate promise. That's going to happen. Kind of a two-phase sort of change that's going to happen. If you want to make a note down Ezekiel 36 and 37. If we have time at the end of the day, we can go look at those. But that echoes that in Ezekiel, this two-phase restoration of Israel. So God has sovereignly and unilaterally and unconditionally promised they're going to be in the land. That's what we see here. It's building on this Abrahamic covenant. 682 years later, God comes in and answers a bunch of questions. Do we still own the land? Yes. Are we going to eject these nations? Yes. Are you going to be with us? Yes. How do we do this? Obey the Mosaic law. Obey the Mosaic law. That's what he says. Any questions? Okay, next session then, we'll start in a little bit. We'll take a break here. We're going to see that we're going to look at the seed now. Okay, so we've looked at the land aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. It's being expanded. It's being reinforced. It's being elaborated on. Now we're going to look at the seed. The seed element is going to be elaborated and expanded upon, narrowed down. They continue to expand over a period of time. You'll see a long period of time is transpiring here. God continues to be committed to his covenant with them. And he continues to commit himself more and more and more, limiting his course of action, allowing us to see what he's going to do in history. His intention to bring glory to himself again. And then this earthly kingdom fulfilling the failed stewardship of Adam. Remember in Genesis 1:28, Adam was given charge over the earth. And he lost that. So somehow that's got to be restored. Right? And we'll see that this failed stewardship of Adam starts coming into view. How are we going to restore this stewardship over what God's created? Who's going to come in and succeed where Adam failed? We're going to see that start to expand here. Again, all tied back to the Abrahamic covenants, seminal blessing of land, seed, and blessing. All tied and all expanding across the Bible. Any questions? So how do we react to this? Again, how we react to this is to give God glory. I mean, let's glorify him as Paul glorifies him at the end of Romans 11. After Paul reflects on the fact that God's promises continue to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All the covenants continue. He steps back and he says, this is unbelievable. How would I ever know any of this if God hadn't told me? How would we have this perspective at all? So again, my prayer for us, for me, for you, is that at the end of the session today, we walk away just amazed at what God is doing.